Good evening, everybody. Welcome. My name is Sultan Rana, and I'm Sakana's course director at York University's Faculty of Education. I am I hail from York Region District School Board, where I'm on secondment from, where I served for nearly 15 years as a in-class teacher from grades 4 to 8, a consultant, and as a school-wide support educator. Um, this year at the faculty, I serve as co-chair along with my partner, my co-lead, Sayema Chowdhury, who we were we were graciously selected to co-chair and run this year's events. So where the Faculty of Education Summer Institute has now become the year-long, bi-monthly Faculty of Education Summer Institute, we have been, in the face of COVID-19, turned what was once a two-day conference to a year-long webinar series. So to all of those in the YouTube world who are on YouTube Live chiming in with us right now, all 200 of you watching at this very moment, we welcome you to our third in our series, which is titled Decolonizing Mental Health. We really look forward to an invigorating conversation that will happen within the YouTube Live chat box. And please just know that our panelists will not be privy to those conversations, as we're kind of inoculated into in a Zoom conversation that's being live streamed for you. So we, as always, we welcome a very invigorating conversation, a critical conversation. These are topics that go against the status quo, that are not mainstream thinking. And so there will be a great deal of agreements, disagreements, affirmations, questions, learning and unlearning. And with that tension, sometimes can be very critical conversations, and we welcome that. But what we would like to bring to your attention is that we do reserve the right to exclude or remove someone from the chat box that is very clearly engaging in antagonizing conversation, antagonizing statements, identity-based attacks, or items that tread on hate speech, be it ideas or personal attacks at any of our panelists or individuals in the chat box. So please do know that we looked to create a brave space, but unequivocally a safe space no less. For those of you that would like to take it on yourself, and if anything occurs in the chat box that perturbs you or makes you feel unsafe, know very well that if you log off for the sake of clarity in your mental health, please know that we will have this recording open and ready for you following tonight's session, where it will be separate from the chat box as well. Okay, so with that said, I welcome you tonight. Thank you for joining us, and I would like to pass it on to my co-lead, Sayema Chowdhury.
Hello. So as mentioned, my name is Sayema Chowdhury. I am the seconded course director at the Faculty of Education at York University. My home board is Peel District School Board, where I had the privilege of serving in the capacity of what is called a Climate for Learning and Working resource teacher. My portfolio was kindergarten to grade 12. I also was a science department head, as well as a teacher of science, English, special education, student success, credit recovery. So as Sultan mentioned, he and I are the co-chairs of FESI 2020. And on behalf of our team, including our faculty advisors, Dr. Vidya Shah, Dr. Carl James, as well as Superintendent Jack Negro from Durham District School Board and our amazing planning committee, we thank you sincerely for being with us tonight. It has always been the goal of this institution to disrupt and dismantle, to ask good questions, very necessary questions, to get into trouble, good trouble, to challenge institutions, to challenge policymakers, to initiate real change that makes a difference for historically marginalized students. The problems that we discuss have been problems for too many years. The Institute has always invited educators to work alongside community partners and agencies, recognizing that we are all better when we work together. Our speakers tonight will represent roles in educational leadership, in teaching, and in community. For over a decade, many district school boards have been partners in the support of this institute. This is critical in knowledge mobilization and to increase the likelihood that talks like this will transfer into action. We thank Toronto District School Board, Toronto Catholic District School Board, York Region District School Board, Peel District School Board, Dufferin Peel Catholic District School Board, Durham District School Board, Halton District School Board, Halton Catholic District School Board, Ottawa Carleton District School Board, and Kawartha Pine Ridge District School Board for both their past and hopefully their ongoing support. Before we move on forward, I would like to start by acknowledging the land. So we do recognize that many of us are tuning in for a variety of different places and spaces, and we would encourage you and invite you to take a mindful moment to think about the land acknowledgement that is best situated for your place. Given that we are broadcasting from York University, we are going to do a land acknowledgement that is situated to York University. So we recognize that many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territories upon which York University campuses are located that precede the establishment of York University. York University acknowledges its presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations. The area known as Tkaronto has been caretaken by the Anishinaabeg Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Huron-Wendat, and the Métis. It is now home to many Indigenous peoples. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This territory is subject to the Dish with One Spoon, Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. As we acknowledge the land, I hope that we take moments to really internalize the meaning and the purpose of the land acknowledgement. For me, to attribute personal meaning to the acknowledgement and to be mindfully reflective of its implications, its origins, its current context, has been something that I've been working on continuously. Today, when I think of the land, especially in the framework of tonight's webinar, I think of the wisdom of understanding that we are one with the land. From a colonial standpoint, we tend to speak of the environment and of nature as if it's like a separate entity from ourselves. We place ourselves as humans as if we are above the land in hierarchy. Whereas Indigenous wisdom would remind us that there is no separation and that we are supposed to have a reciprocal relationship with the land. The land sustains us, it nurtures us, it provides for us, and we too must nurture, provide, and sustain the land. This hierarchical viewpoint has allowed us to commodify the land and to seek to control it for personal purposes, often monetary and capitalistic in nature. We have severed relationships with the land based in respect, responsibility, and reciprocity. In her writing, A Yield of a Different Kind, by Linda Hogan of the Chickasaw First Nation, she states, "There is a separation that has taken place between us and nature. Something has broken deep in the core of ourselves." Psychologist C.A. Meyer notes that as the wilderness has disappeared outside of us, it has gone to live inside the human mind. Because we are losing vast tracts of wilderness, we are not only losing a part of ourselves, but the threat to life, which once existed in the world around us, has now moved within. The whole of Western society, he says, is approaching a physical and mental breaking point. The result is a spiritual fragmentation that has accompanied our ecological destruction. I'd like to encourage all of us in our capacity as educators, whether that's a formal title that you might hold in education or an informal title as a nurturer and caregiver who's modeling for younger generations, to reflect on what the land acknowledgement means to us, has meant to us in our past, what it means to us in our current circumstances, and what we would like it for it to mean for our future generations, and how we can model this intentional acknowledgement and action towards reclamation of relationships with the land to support the well-being of all. I'd like to end by acknowledging the many Indigenous scholars whom I've been learning from through their writings and their publications, and to Dr. Alicia Moffat, who has been guiding me through my learning journey that's allowed me to provide some of the thoughts surrounding the land acknowledgement tonight. Before we move into our panel, we have the great honor of having with us tonight Colleen Russell Rollins to bring greetings from the Peel District School Board. And she's very busy, but she's made time to be with us tonight. So thank you so much, Colleen, for being here. It's greatly appreciated. Colleen Russell-Rawlins has recently named the interim permanent director of the Peel District School Board, Canada's second largest school board. Over her 29-year career, Ms. Russell-Rawlins has held a variety of roles in education, including teacher, principal, consultant, and superintendent. As an associate director of the Toronto District School Board, her team had the responsibility for several aspects of TDSB's multi-year strategic action plans focused on ending various forms of streaming by improving early literacy and improving access to academic pathways, in addition to responsibilities for professional learning in equity, anti-racism, and anti-oppression. Recently, she developed a proposal to establish the Center of Excellence for Black Student Achievement in TDSB, the first of its kind in Canada. She values the collaboration of working with staff, superintendents, trustees, and community. During her time, Ms. Russell-Rawlins has established respectful and trusting relationships with the Parent Involvement Committee and the Black Student Achievement Community Advisory Committee, where she served as staff lead. She has served on the board of directors of Taivu community agencies, as well as other community agencies. In 2018, she served as the president of the Ontario Supervisory Officers Association, and most recently was recognized as one of the 100 accomplished Black women in Canada of 2020. Please join me in welcoming Colleen Russell-Rawlins.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sayema, and good evening, everyone. It is my pleasure to be with you briefly this evening to offer some introductory remarks and then to rejoin you as a learner in this evening's conversation. And I'm very excited by this topic this afternoon. The topic of decolonizing mental health and well-being is an area of great importance that has prompted, I think, further introspection, self-reflection, and continued learning for me, both personally and professionally over the past few years. As you were speaking, Sayema, it made me think about a quote that I read recently by Robin Wall Kimmerer, who wrote Braiding Sweetgrass, Indigenous Wisdom, Scientific Knowledge, and the Teachings of Plants. And that quote is, "The land knows you even when you are lost." And so tonight, as we talk about, as you talk about decolonizing mental health, I think that quote has particular resonance. Certainly in this time of crisis, where the spaces and communities in which we have traditionally found the resources to support our mental health and well-being have shifted. For some, it has placed those resources further apart, while for others, those changes have allowed for greater investment in family and self-love. I'm keenly aware that many of us in our own ways are grappling with dual pandemics. The first, obviously, is COVID-19. The second is the long-standing and insidious impact of racism. And in particular, I would name anti-Black racism, both of which are having a negative impact on communities and a disproportionate impact from the data on specific groups of students, staff, and families, especially in Peel Region and in Toronto. I will offer my comments this evening by way of a recent quote from a dialogue with a student, which I think exemplifies some of the emerging priorities for me as a director, as we re-examine what it means to create mentally healthy spaces for students and communities. In a conversation with a grade 12 student where we were talking about some of her experiences of discrimination within the school and where she was engaging in some sense making and talking about how it has impacted her, she left me with this quote, "I don't want to just survive, I want to thrive." And I know that has been said before in many different spaces by others, but it struck me in that this quote positions at least two, possibly more really important ideas. Firstly, for so long, well-meaning educators thought that the standard was to teach students how to survive discrimination in education and in the community. how to navigate unequal discipline, exclusion from experiences that they had the prerequisite skills and interests to participate in. Whether it was to navigate the questioning of their academic ability, how to respond to hate speech or microaggressions. Essentially, we were teaching our students, our Black, Indigenous, transgendered, Muslim, Jewish students, just as examples, how to navigate a system that promotes white supremacy as a sign of success rather than dismantling the very real barriers that existed for students individually and collectively and were having an impact on their sense of belonging and well-being. Developing resistance was seen as a rite of passage for many equity-seeking students. That must end. We will not fix the children. We will end the discrimination. Last year, Toronto Public Health declared anti-Black racism as a public health crisis. And for so many of us, we knew that in our bones, in our daily experiences. But it was, I think, for many who don't have that lived experience, a real awakening to the impact of racism on the mental health of individuals. Yeah. And we need to acknowledge that as school systems and not put that aside. And we need to take responsibility for that. To teach someone to endure it is normalizing it, and it serves to perpetuate the system. And as I said, that must stop. Secondly, the quote also raises the expectation that in this student's words, that schools and communities have the potential to create the conditions for all students to thrive. It is their expectation when they walk through the door that the conditions of schools will allow them to become themselves and to become better versions of themselves because of what happens in our classrooms and in our schools. And we as educators have a duty to live up to those expectations. As a director, it's my goal that schools and classrooms focus on emotionally nurturing classroom spaces for young people. Classroom environments, the relationships within it, the resources, the structures, all contribute to or detract from students' well-being. One of the important factors is really understanding and respecting students' identities and lived experiences and the discriminatory or differential treatment that they may face. We should ask ourselves the questions: how are we identifying, naming, addressing, and eliminating individual acts of discrimination, and perhaps even more importantly, systemic inequities in our schools and classrooms? And what are the pedagogical approaches that ensure that students are heard when they speak their truth? It is my belief that we cannot talk about creating nurturing spaces and investing in well-being until we critically examine how we conceptualize our relationships with students and how we talk about behavior. The ministry report on the Peel District School Board mandates an examination of suspensions and expulsions. I would suggest that as educators for a long time, myself included, we probably used many coded terms that have either been misunderstood or misused, such as self-regulation and resilience, without critically examining how the environment can either protect or traumatize students and directly perpetuates the behaviors that students exhibit and then are suspended for. This critical analysis of how we see our relationships with students, how we see our power as educators, is important in this discussion of supporting students' mental health and well-being. The saliency of race, gender, sexuality, religion, and many other factors are critically important to this dialogue and how we perceive mental health and our role in supporting each other's well-being. As a district, we're also on the path to co-creating with communities restorative justice practices that provide healing and dignity and reparations. And it is my belief that when used appropriately, this will be an investment in our collective well-being as a community and as an educational community. In closing, I have to quote Audre Lorde, who wrote that a rallying cry that many of us quote, which is caring for myself is not self-indulgence, it is self-preservation. That, for me, is an act of survival and revolution. I think the pandemics have taught us that there is a role and a need often for what I will call loosely formalized mental health support. And for many, the counseling offered by regulated professionals has fallen short. And we know that we have to learn from community spaces, both through regulated health professionals who practice culturally responsive approaches, as well as more Indigenous ways of supporting mental health and well-being as a district. And that we have to broaden how we provide supports and to learn with and from communities and to engage them in supporting students and families, and to be vigilant in how we monitor the impact of formalized and regulated care on Black and Indigenous families for far too long, who have faced additional traumas through systems of care. For many of the participants this evening who hold intersectional identities and who are faced with the burdens of discrimination, I personally see you. I hope that that quote by Audre Lorde gives you some sustenance and some support, and you have my commitment to continuing to evolve how we address complaints that come forward in the Peel District School Board from our staff. We have tremendous work to do in that regard, but I'm committed to moving forward with it. So I hope all members tonight will join me in examining our own belief systems and our behaviors and how we conceptualize mental health and well-being, and that we all strive to become more informed, supportive, anti-racist educators that our students deserve. Thank you, and I look forward to rejoining the conversation.
Oh, thank you so much, Colleen. We know how busy you are, and you taking the time to come and be with us to share your leadership vision, which is very clear, no wishy-washy. It's such an inspiration to hear you speak truthfully about the underlying systems and the things that really do need to be spoken about. And we know that until things are acknowledged, we can't work on them to make them better. And I think that it's very inspirational, and it shows your commitment and your vision for you to take the time to really be with us tonight to set us off and start us off on these conversations. And on behalf of students and staff everywhere, not just in Peel, I'm biased because I'm here in Peel, but on behalf of everybody who's watching, I know that your words are going to be a source of hope and power for many of us. So thank you so much again for being with us tonight and starting us off. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Okay, well, with that, we are going to move on to our panel tonight. I'm going to introduce our panelists in order of their speaking engagements. So I'm going to start first with Dr. Jennifer Mullan. Jennifer creates spaces for people and organizations to heal. She believes that it is essential to create dialogue to address how mental health is deeply affected by systemic inequities and the trauma of oppression, particularly the well-being of queer, Indigenous, Black, Brown people of color. Dr. Mullan has earned her doctorate of psychology in clinical psychology from the California Institute of Integral Studies, a master's in counseling and community agencies from New York University's Steinhardt School of Education, and her bachelor's of arts in psychology and elementary education from New Jersey City University. She notes that her dissertation, love this, Slavery and the Intergenerational Transmission of Trauma in Inner City African American Male Youth, from Cotton Fields to the Concrete Jungle, has been a primary foundation for her current work in furthering the decolonization discourse in mental health, and particularly for therapists. As the founder and CEO of Decolonizing Therapy, and most notably known as the content creator and educator for Instagram's @Decolonizing Therapy, with a community of followers of over 125,000, Dr. Mullan and her team seek to dismantle and decolonize systems of oppression, beginning with the mental health industrial complex. Decolonizing Therapy offers workshops, keynotes, educational discussions, and retreats that help the practitioner to unpack and become curious about the systems in which they've become educated and the ways in which they have become socialized. Currently, Dr. Mullan is a full-time psychologist at New Jersey University's Counseling Center, facilitator of the campus LGBTQIA+ support group, coordinator of the university's nationally recognized peer education program, Peers Educating Peers, instructor of graduate counseling courses, and a proud LGBTQIA+ Gothic Night Ally Safe Zone trainer. She is passionately committed to solidarity work that effectively addresses inequities based on race, gender, class, ability, gender identity, and sexual orientation. Her professional research and clinical interests include complex and intergenerational trauma, group psychotherapy, LGBTQIA+ wellness, spirituality and mindfulness practices, racism as trauma, healing in therapeutic settings, self-love as a revolutionary act, and the process of decolonizing mental health. She loves spending time at the ocean, being a tourist in her backyard of New York City, Zumba, and spending time with her loved ones, including her cat, Isis. Thank you so much, despite all that going on, for you've taken time to be with us tonight. Thank you so much, Dr. Mullan.
Thank you for having me. It's an honor to be here. Thank you. Thank you.
Next, we have Cheryl Woolnough. Cheryl has been teaching for several years around the world. She has taught in the UK, the Caribbean, Asia, and now here in Canada with the Peel District School Board. She has taught several grades and secured leadership positions over the years. Currently, Cheryl is an educator with the Peel District School Board, working with a wonderful bunch of curious and beautiful minds. Outside of her work hours, Cheryl supports a high school boys group as a teacher mentor within the Peel District School Board. She also collaborates with Peel teachers at her local ATFO union known as AREC, the union's Anti-Racism and Equity Committee, focusing on issues related to anti-racism, anti-oppressive practices, equity, and inclusion. Cheryl also provides professional and social development for parents, students, and staff via workshops and presentations within the school board and the wider community. In addition to these items, Cheryl is a board member of the Ontario Alliance of Black School Educators, ANABSE, where she is an active and enthusiastic member in charge of the Mental Health and Wellbeing Commission. Cheryl is an advocate and community activist who is passionate about the success of Black and marginalized students, firmly believing that all children can succeed with time, care, patience, and careful programming through a race equity lens. At home, Cheryl loves cooking and creating a variety of international dishes for her family and friends. More than anything, she loves spending time with her children, family, and friends in order to create beautiful memories. Thank you so much, Cheryl, for joining us tonight, and I hope that tonight you'll be creating some more beautiful memories with us. Okay, so with our panelists introduced, we're just going to make maximum use of our time. So we're just going to start off with Dr. Mullan. I have a question for you. What does it mean to decolonize mental health?
It's a beautiful question. Well, where I would start in decolonizing mental health is first looking at the ways in which we have been conditioned to believe that wellness occurs and in what pockets, what places, and what spaces. So one of the things that comes up for me when I think of decolonization, right, is the undoing process. And that is not something that many of us are taught in schools, right? You're taught how to pathologize, essentially. You're taught how to diagnose. You're taught how to treat. We're not taught how to heal, or how to bring healing into classrooms, into therapeutic containers, or into our places and spaces where we are advocates. Yeah. So when I think of decolonization of mental health, I think of holding systems of care accountable, right? Without holding systems of care accountable, we continue to recreate and replicate the same harm, particularly on Indigenous, Black, Brown bodies. So part of the decolonization process is also being a critical lover and being willing to unpack, undo, and dismantle a great deal of the trauma that we have endured historically, and for people that are white-bodied, to look at the ways in which they have to take accountability and to do more work to begin to undo, and how should I say this, unzip, right, this cloak of white privilege, right? And we're not just talking white privilege within like the skin tone of it, but also the privilege that comes with being assumed that white is right in theory, in praxis, in research. I was just sitting in a meeting just to exemplify this, maybe about a week or two ago, virtually, of course. And a colleague that I respect very much, and she gave me consent to completely bring this up. You know, it is like, has read all the right books and is all like Robin DiAngelo, you know, like white guilted and white theory, you know, understands it. And when it came to looking at particular students which we were working with, and particular cases in which students would require extended session time, or extended time to be able to come in a little bit later because they were dropping off their children to childcare, or they didn't have enough bus money, or whatever, I could see the stop, the rigidity, right? The place and the space of, well, these are the rules, and we have to follow our rules. And I immediately looked at her like, And we also have to look at why some of these rules are in place in the first place, right? Why do we have these rules? So I think some questions related to decolonizing mental health is like, whose theories are we honoring? Whose voices are we honoring? Who is not in the room? Right? Not even just physically, but whose presence, whose needs are not being accounted for, whose voices are being continuously stifled and silenced, consciously or not, for the betterment of, you know, late stage capitalism and white supremacy. So I think it's really important for us to begin to look at the ways also that our histories of colonization come to continue to be landing in our bodies and make us unwell, you know, create inflammation and dis-ease in our bodies. And many doctors and researchers have supported to the ways in which, as we know, trauma causes inflammation in the body, right? Trauma continuously leads to this kind of overactivated, nervous system, right? This fight, flight, freeze, fawn response, which I think a lot of us are becoming more attuned to. But are we considering this? I think we are, right? And if you're here, likely you are, but, you know, on a larger global level, are we looking at how colonization has affected and been passed down and transmitted intergenerationally, right? Epigenetically, and through role modeling, attachment, I can keep going on. How has that come to land in our bodies? And more important, in the bodies of the youth in which you're teaching, treating, working with, loving, raising. So I think a lot of us often feel this like disconnect with our historical trauma. And I think that is where we are bringing it back, as was being said before, to the land, you know, to our people, to our original ways of doing things. So decolonizing therapy is about reclaiming, right? Reintegrating. It is about bringing it back and reviving, recording. So with the decolonization process, that needs to happen individually first, right? We need to begin to unwrap. It's sort of like this serpent. I'd like to see it as a serpent. I tell this to my students all the time. Like the process of oppression and colonization and white-bodied supremacy continues to play out in all of our minds, including myself, right? And it is a daily practice to, I think it's easier it's a muscle, but it's a daily practice in sort of uncoiling it around the way that we see things, that we've all been collectively socialized, in my humble opinion, unless you've really lived from the land and from the people and the people's teachings. But otherwise, we have continued to be bound up in this terribly Eurocentric way of seeing things without questioning how this continues to impact the people receiving these services. Right? So as an example, right, although I might not be sitting in session saying, okay, so that's intergenerational trauma, let's talk about that. Usually people that I'm serving and working with are coming in saying, I'm just so exhausted. I feel like my professor doesn't hear me. I keep trying to explain A, B, C, and D. I have a letter from the Office of Specialized Services saying I'm struggling with trauma. I'm the only caregiver in my home. My mother is disabled. I'm taking my little brother to school. I'm a DACA recipient. Most of them are undocumented, right? So I'm hearing this constantly. And yet frequently what will happen is if you're not coming from a more conscious, politicized, decolonized frame, whether as a teacher, as a therapist, as a healthcare worker, it's so easy to miss it. Yeah, it's so easy to let that moment pass rather than reminding the individual you're serving or the community or the group that, wait, this isn't just about you. You're not the problem, right? We're also residing in environments and systems and societies that benefit from you thinking that you're lazy and you're the problem. So I take these moments to educate the people that I serve. And I don't make it about me. It's not about Jennifer, right? But I make it about where did you learn that? And where did you learn this? And who told you that you need to work harder? Who told you that you're being lazy? Where does it show up in your body? Who does this remind you of in your life? And usually what comes up, oh, well, my mom just worked nonstop, 3-4 jobs. Oh, my dad is still back in our country and we can't bring him up. Yes. So how has forced migration affected our people, right? How has colonization come in and affected our lands, forcing us to separate from our families of systems, many of us forcing us to come to the countries, not all that we're in now. The other piece I want to point out is that decolonization is very much not a metaphor. I mean, for me, and I know Tuck and Yang, it's a great article around decolonization not being a metaphor, and I would agree completely and totally. Although I have sort of a, so to speak, expertise in the emotional decolonization process, but I think it's important for us to look at the ways in which mental health began. Where did we start? Right? And mental health or treating the human with some form of imbalance or dis-ease began with very spiritual ancestral roots, right? It began with our curanderas and our shamans and our witch doctors of our communities, right? Like trying to take the heaviness or the darkness or the heavy spirit out of the body using nature and forms of nature as a way to reclaim and recenter. And so that is why I think many of us doing this decolonial work are not only trying to hold systems of oppression accountable, right? We're holding and we're looking at how the prison industrial complex intersects with the healthcare system, how that intersects with the education system, right? How that intersects with mental health. And we can keep going on, and our transportation system, we could keep going, and how it continues to benefit many white-bodied individuals, particularly upper class, middle class, people with money, as we know, and continues to not properly impact in the way that we want those that are at or below the poverty line. Yeah, and so frankly, I really feel that the decolonization of mental health and therapy is a battle cry. Yeah, it's a battle cry that we're tired of attending our youth's funerals. Yeah, like we're tired. I'm tired. I go and I have to speak personally because I think that it's important to connect to this work. We don't do decolonization work and just stay in an ivory tower. That would be the antithesis. Yeah, that would be like the absolute worst case scenario. Yeah, no. Part of this work is about returning to our land, our people, our culture, and to humanize those of us who have been dehumanized, to humanize, right, the Black body. What was we were just speaking about, like that anti-Black racism permeates everywhere throughout Central America, throughout South America, throughout South Asia. We can keep going. It's everywhere, right? And in that way, we're so accustomed to demonizing, dehumanizing, pathologizing the Black body, right? I saw this in my country with the murders of George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor and Mike Brown and Sandra Bland, and we can keep going, and we can keep going to countries, cities all across the world in which we have been told over and over that it's not safe. It's not safe. And if we're not safe, and we're feeling internally, unconsciously even, not safe, what is that then transmitting to the little ones? What is that transmitting, right? To our teenagers, to our 2-year-olds who can very much understand and read, right? I'm sure Cheryl can identify, and you see, like we can really, really begin to realize that our children pick up cues from us, right? We know this. We know that they pick up the nonverbal. And so as a psychologist, my job is to say, I love my field, but I'm a critical lover. I've learned to become a critical lover. And that means saying, hey, yeah, therapy, the way that we've been taught, may work for some people, or it may work for a year and a half, according to many of my students of color. Like, it's good. But when we don't begin to bring parts of ourselves into it, as teachers, as therapists, as healthcare workers, if we continue to put up this sort of like big glass, I don't even know what to call it, sort of obscuring curtain over part of our personality, who we are, what we believe, even I would dare say our political leanings, as scary as that might be, then we don't have a right to say that we're in the practice of trying to decolonize anything, right? If we're not willing to also fully show up and fully help people understand that we are living and growing these youth, growing them up in a very sick system, right? And as long as we're in this very sick system, how can we fully be well, right? So it's like I'm running in a rat circle. I'm over here trying to help people and heal them and treat them. But meanwhile, we're in a society that continues to benefit off of their lack of well-being and off of their deaths. So for me, decolonizing therapy is about the reclamation, is about the returning to the indigenous, to the land, to our nativeness, to our Africanness, to our, to our Blackness, to all of it. It is bringing it back and also holding these systems accountable and acknowledging the historical grief and trauma that has continued to be passed down in our bodies. And there's one other piece I want to say. The decolonization process is also about calling each other in a lot more. And I think that is something that does not frequently happen in a lot of our spaces because it's unsafe. Yeah, what happens when we step outside and we stand up for a youth or a family member, we get popped right back down. Right? You either don't get transferred to the grade you want, or, suddenly you're transferred to another school with a stricter system. Anytime we ask too many questions, we've learned that we're going to get in trouble, right? We're going to get in trouble. And with that, I would say, well, my mental health system's already in trouble living in these systems, right? Our youth are in trouble. They're consistently being over-pathologized and targeted for simply being. Anger is over-pathologized, right? Their trauma symptoms are over-pathologized. So I would say to that process is moving away from individualism, that decolonizing, that reclaiming, and getting closer to what might collective work look like in our school systems? What might collective healing look like amongst a group of teachers or a group of therapists or a group of school nurses? What might really bringing healing back in require? And I might say that might require being a critical lover and really looking at pedagogy and theory, and again, I could speak for psychology and social work and counseling and saying there are some great, wonderful things about psychotherapy and psychoanalytic work and CBT, But these theories that we've been ingrained and like brainwashed with are predominantly older, cisgendered, heterosexual white males, right? It's their theories that we continue to be teaching our schools and our children and our counselors, right? And we wonder why counselors are just burned out consistently. So I know this is a very long answer, but but I wanted to say, like, yeah, you know, why are our children sick? Why are we not well? And I want to say that it's not us, and I'm tired of it being about us, right? Individual, rather than looking at the systems that continue to poison the water that our babies drink from. We must hold them accountable.
Wow. Wow. So much to say as a follow-up. I mean, thank you for that. So much for us to think about in terms of community identity, what we're told about identities that don't differ from European identities. I think many of us, because, you know, a lot of us are here because we have been socialized within the system. So even though we may look the way that we look, we still have all that internalization going on, and that's why we're here, right? I mean, these are things that we need to think about. And the power that you speak about in terms of, you know, really, I've engaged in these conversations where people will say, well, has anybody ever said anything to you about, like, you're not allowed to say certain things? Like, how do you know you're not allowed to say that? And I didn't really have an answer. And I think that many of us just know that we know, because we're socialized into it. It's all of those microaggressions that Colleen was referring to earlier. It's all of these, you know, things that are said and not said that really tell us, you know your place, behave a certain way, and be like us, right? I mean, there's all this stuff that's going on. And I certainly have been on a personal journey a lot about thinking about decolonizing mental health and emotional labors that our students feel, and really thinking about what was my personal journey growing up, and how have I been socialized, and how am I complicit in these systems, recreating these systems? Is this really something that I value, that my culture values? Or is this something that I'm just recreating because that's how I've been socialized? And I think we all need to take that pause, you've mentioned it, and really think about that calling in and thinking about how we are really complicit in these systems, because they're perpetuating because of us. If we're part of the system, then, you know, somebody's got to take that responsibility, and it has to be each and every single one of us. Absolutely. You touched on it a bit, Jennifer, about the idea of like the inflammation. And we know that, for example, Black women, the shortened life expectancies. A lot of the time we hear about a lot of our equity leaders and boards and different organizations having to take leave, like extended medical leave, because they're just burnt out. There's nothing left to give, because you're giving all that you can. You're seen as a sign of hope, and you keep giving. But there's nothing filling you back up, because the systems just keep holding you down. I'm just wondering, what have you seen from your experiences about other impacts on racialized and minoritized students? What do you see in your work?
Yeah, great, beautiful question. Well, I think that my response would be like, what are we not seeing that doesn't continue to sort of make my stomach hurt on a consistent basis? I think that, well, the word, I'm such a big person when it comes to like language, right? Because I think that language has the capacity to help us liberate, but it is so also dangerous with the way that it can be utilized. Like the word minority, like when I hear my youth be identified as minorities, I'm like, oh, no, there's nothing minor about you. You're not a minority, right? And so I start thinking about the ways that we classify. Yeah, classification systems. I know that in the US, what's really big are these like no child left behind classrooms, and they're integrating with like special ed. But in reality, what happens in many of our classrooms are that there's more labeling and pathologizing, particularly of youth. And they can have high GPAs or high grades or be super emotionally intelligent. But what matters is, oh wait, they're out of line. Their voice is a little too loud. They're raging. Well, and then some of us would come in and say, well, of course they're raging. Such and such is happening in their home. Father was just deported back to Kenya. Mother just this, like, of course they're raging. This is what's happening. So what I often notice is a lot of what Dr. Joy DeGruy-Leary talks about in post-traumatic slave syndrome when it comes to Black-bodied youth, which is like this more vacant self-esteem, this sense of just like learned hopelessness and helplessness, a feeling as though no one is going to see me anyway, so F it, I don't care, right? Flat affect sometimes when it comes to violence in and around them, right? Because we're so desensitized. We become so used to a consistent state of violence and or being used to people seeing us as violent, even if we are not being violent at all, right? So I remember being in school and teachers consistently saying, like, Jennifer talks too much, and Jennifer, ha ha ha, right? Like, you wouldn't have guessed that, but Jennifer, too much aggression, too much this. Like, in other words, get her back in her place, right? Like, get her back in her place. And that's where I believe there's this unconscious thread and belief that white is right. That everything that it is that we do, every measurement, although I hate it, every measurement is based off of whiteness, right? In terms of how students should act, how they learn, whether or not they could be moving while they're learning, how their bodies need to engage when they're in this hormonal, right, pubescent period, as well as the ways that we continue to punish them, even though we may be calling it consequence. We know through research that darker skinned students are getting punishments that then send them into the school to prison nexus pipeline, which we know is a deal breaker and can be a family breaker and a life breaker and continues to impede generations, 7 generations after them. I would also dare say, and I wrote this down because I did not want to forget it, that in the US, 1.7 million students are in schools with cops and no counselors. Yeah, 1.7 million students. When I first, and 3 million students are in schools with cops and no nurses. Yeah, and we can keep going, but these numbers are staggering. And where we see these cops, right, are in these places and spaces that are seen as like the inner city, right? Or where we see violence in the communities. But what this also points out to me is this setting up our students to get kind of desensitized to law enforcement in and around them all the time. Yeah. And it desensitizes the teachers, consciously or not. It could be unconsciously, right? No shade, but to this belief that when students are in trouble, they're kind of like expendable, disposable, and that you need to listen to me, and you need to listen to me like this. And I think that that's super punitive. Some of the other ways that I see many people of color, particularly Black and Brown identified people, Indigenous people, deeply affected by these systems are by our psychiatry, right? By the way that the psychiatry movement continues to impede people's well-being. There's many cultural bound diseases or illnesses, so to speak, mental health issues and symptoms. But yet quickly, we are taught in psychiatry to medicate. We are quickly taught to bring somebody in line, corral them rather, get them to follow instructions, and then just keep moving as if nothing's happened. But there's grief involved in receiving a mental health diagnosis. Yeah, there's grief involved in your child receiving a diagnosis of a learning disability or learning, reading differently than other children, or Asperger's, or autism. There's some grief in that, and I think that we're not slowing down enough. We're still in this very individualistic, as I said before, late stage capitalism perspective, where we just have to grieve and go, right? And we still have to function. So as you were saying, and part of your question is part of capitalism fatigue, in my humble opinion. I don't know if there's really imposter syndrome as much as there is white-bodied supremacy. Yeah, I don't know if there's really just burnout, and I don't want to minimize it because I've had it myself in my life, and I've had to take 6 weeks off because yes, here we are continuing to do what we've done on the very plantations and where we were stolen and brought, right? To continue to take care of everyone's children, everybody's needs, placing our needs on the back burner. And frankly, all the time. Yes, Cheryl, all the time. And frankly, I think a form of healthy reparation would be to let Black folks effing rest. Right? Like rest is revolutionary. Yeah. And not just in the form of naps, right? Although a nap would be great. I don't know the last time I had a nap, right? But rest in the form of not working as many hours, friends being conscious of the emotional labor that they're placing on us, right? Our employers being conscious of what they're asking of us, answering emails after hours, right? Being of the support to everyone, being the mammy. Although no one is saying it, it is unconsciously being passed down. So to me, I think that a lot of what has happened is that Blackness, particularly Black femmes and women identified people, continue to be the big, large teat, milking everybody, and yet feeling guilty for taking mental health days for ourselves, and feeling guilty, for stepping back, as Colleen was saying, and taking care of ourselves. As Audre Lorde mentioned, it is revolutionary for Black and Brown and Indigenous folks to begin to slow down, take care of themselves, take sabbaticals. Teachers deserve sabbaticals, Therapists deserve sabbaticals, not just professors at a university level. And again, these are the ways that I believe anyway, that we must begin to decolonize academia, our school systems, our school boards. It's not working. It's not working. These individualistic, competitive, these are forms of internalized white supremacy. And these are things that we've all internalized, including myself. So just as a reminder, I think that also it brings us to the ancestral piece, right? A lot of times our religions or spiritualities or ways of honoring and being with earth and spirit are also pathologized, are also seen as a problem, are not honored and respected. So I tell my students all the time, they're like, no, how is such and such religion, a privilege? And I said, well, you automatically get days off when you're that religion to honor your high holy days. Do Muslims automatically get paid and get those high holy days respected? Right? What about those of us in Santeria? What about that? So it helps people to understand where are the points of privilege, where are the points of oppression, and where can we begin weaving and threading and filling these gaps up so that we can live and thrive and not have shorter life expectancies. I know that us here, we want to have a retirement, right? Right? And we want to live in a way now, right? As I create my business, I'm saying to myself, how can I live now where I don't have to wait for a vacation? How can I create a life now that would allow me to role model this healthiness to the people that I'm serving, to set limits and to say, I'm no longer going to take abuse from these systems? How do we do this, and how do we begin to role model this? I have more questions, more than I do answers. But I think that's part of the decolonization process, is asking harder questions rather than needing to know answers that we have to live our way into.
Well, I'm thinking about so much as you speak, and part of it is the modeling, right? We can say to our children, be proud of who you are. You have the right to a safe space, but do we model that for them? Or do we continue to take the abuse that some of us do face when we are speaking up about differences? Are we gaslit into thinking from other people saying, hold on a second, are you just being sensitive about that? Or is that something that's really there? Or I can understand why that's important to you because, that would impact your identity. And it's like, well, hold on a second. When I spoke up for everybody else's identity, You didn't think I was being sensitive then, right? There might be some authenticity to what I'm saying, but at the same time, you don't necessarily verbalize that. A lot of the time we take that home and we think about it, and we think about, why was I not able to say what I needed to say in that moment to preserve myself? I think it's interesting that you speak about the idea that, we're put in these positions where we have to take care of everybody else. And it's true. I've been in situations where, and I've heard this from many of my racialized, female in particular identifying colleagues, where, we're told, yes, that was a very horrible situation that happened to you, but you're a strong woman and you're going to get through this. And my sister, who's my baby sister, but she is a lawyer, but she's my baby sister. But she said to me one time when I spoke to her about this, she said, yeah, you're a damn strong woman. And that doesn't absolve your workplace employer for taking responsibility to create that safe space for you. You have the right to a safe space just like anybody else. So we take, we are put in these situations, we speak up, we're gaslit into thinking there's something wrong with our way of thinking, be grateful for what you have, and you were wrong to speak up. And then, we're abused, and then we're told that, you're strong. That was wrong, but you're strong and you're going to get through this. And our children see this. They see it. And so, I mean, it's again, that cycle, right? How do we break that cycle? And how do we make it so that our children don't have that emotional labor that they're carrying that is not understood by dominant groups? If you live in a dominant identity, I wish you could understand when we hear our children speak, what they say to us about the pain that they carry and the fact that they don't even feel that they can verbalize it within their spaces to adults that are supposed to be caring for them, who are paid to care for them, who have a moral and legal obligation to care for them.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
So,
yes.
Cheryl, you had the opportunity to moderate a panel through NUBSI this summer on mental health and well-being, and the colonial impact on Black students in particular. Yeah. Given that you're Ontario-based, in hearing, being very much part of this conversation, active within the community, active within these conversations, what are you hearing from an Ontario perspective?
So before I start, I just want us to have a brief moment of silence for Jamal Francisque, DeAndre Campbell, and Ijaz Chowdhury, all three from the region of Peel in which I work, all three murdered by Peel police while they were in crisis, a mental health crisis. So memories go to them, and our thoughts, prayers to their families too. Thank you. So I'll move on with that. Jennifer, amazing, thank you. So what we found is that COVID is another layer of stress and trauma, within the Black, African, and Caribbean communities. We already know how deeply embedded anti-Black racism is, not just in education, but in every sector of society, including the healthcare sector. And we just have to go back and look in history that enslaved Black Africans were used like animals, to experiment on, via, doctors who used our enslaved ancestors as experimental tools. And hence the fact, we weren't seen as humans. And to this day, we are still dehumanized alongside our Indigenous brothers and sisters. We have to look back in history to know that Canada is a settler colony. We have a deep, dark, insidious history of Indigenous genocide and slavery. And a lot of people outside of Canada, as well as in Canada, are not aware that Canada had approximately 206 years of slavery. The notion, the romantic notion of the Underground Railroad does not exist, because they came up here seeking freedom to be enslaved and treated the same way as they were in the United States. Yes, we are like America, very much like America. It's just that Canada unleashes white supremacy with a smile while killing your soul in the process. Whew. And it continues. And for our non-Canadian viewers who do not use the term anti-Black racism, I'll give a brief definition and term coined by Afua Benjamin, a retired professor at Ryerson University. And this definition can be found on the Black Health Alliance website. And it states, anti-Black racism is defined here as policies and practices rooted in Canadian institutions such as education, healthcare, and justice that mirror and reinforce beliefs, attitudes, and prejudice, stereotyping, and/or discrimination towards people of Black African descent. So anti-Black racism is a pandemic. It's a pandemic that is centuries years old and continues today, and it manifests in our bodies. You know, as Dr. Mullan mentioned, you know, Jennifer mentioned, it manifests in our bodies in different ways. We know that there's a high incidence of high blood pressure, diabetes, cholesterol, stress, even memory loss, you know, sometimes forgetfulness that is automatically assumed that you don't know your job, you don't know what you're doing. And then, you know, you will find that those with deep-rooted racist minds will use that as a tool to try and discredit you as a professional. You know, we can see the disparities within the Black African and Caribbean communities, and as it is in education. And we know that COVID-19 has impacted our Black African and Caribbean communities. And many are frontline workers and live in underserved communities where community resources are often inaccessible or limited. And that impacts our students each and every day as they walk into the classrooms. Do they have enough food? You know, are families sick? You know, I knew of a family where mother's raising 3 beautiful girls, and she caught COVID, and, you know, and the fear, you know, of COVID. And I know other members that caught COVID, but were frightened to go to the hospital because of the fear of how they'd be treated. And then you hear that, you know, and see the data that it's our Black and you know, brown communities that are impacted the most. I'll give a brief example. I cut my finger, gashed it very deeply during COVID to the extent that it really needed stitches. I'm an ex-nurse, it really needed stitches. And my son was like, Mom, I think you might need to go. I said, there's no way I'm touching that hospital door. It really wasn't. And I bled and bled and bled and bled. And I basically got the home remedies, you know, to bandage up the finger. But that cut took nearly 2.5 weeks to heal and seal, because I didn't want to go to the hospital, based on how I know as an ex-nurse how the hospital and healthcare system operates. And that's one of the reasons why I left. So, you know, parents are stressed, you know, balancing work and supporting their children. And, you know, we've heard of parents working long hours and relying on precarious work, which results in unstable incomes. You know, and this has a huge impact on the household where, you know, parents have to put food on the table and keep a roof over their heads, you know, so that's important, you know, as opposed to a new device that they might need for learning, or the internet, which they may, you know, so it's a toss up between food on the table, roof over our heads, or educational resources that are highly expensive and they can't afford. So, you know, so we have that factor, you know, and also too with the fact with online learning with our students that we need to look at our students holistically and teach from, you know, I love to teach from a multiple intelligence stance, where I see a kid that's musical, let's get some music on there. A child that's physical, let's get movement on. A child that's visual. So in that space, that's how I incorporate. But how do you do that when you're online students stuck in front of a screen all day, which we know that, you know, online screen time has an effect on the brain and, you know, overactive brains and sensitivity, especially if students do have or are diagnosed with ADHD. On that online screen time, sitting constantly all day is not healthy. It's not where we are from. We are from the land of movement. We are from Africa, moving out in the sun and teaching. I remember when I was teaching in the Caribbean, I was there for 5 years. I would take my class out under the almond tree and we would teach. We'd go to the mango tree and pick the mangoes. You know, I had that beautiful opportunity of just moving around and connecting with the land in the beautiful sunshine. So they're unable to do that. They're stuck in front of a device all day, literally. And many parents don't have access to printers. While printers and ink, while printers may be cheaper today, the ink often costs more than the actual printer. And then you buy that cartridge of ink that's very expensive, and you're lucky if you get 20 sheets out of that. So, school boards have been diligent in distributing devices, but we have to also look at children with multiple siblings. If, one device per family, what happens if there's a family with 4 or 5 children? How does that work? And also finding out too, a mother told me that while she was using one device, her phone was being used all day. So she didn't really have access to her phone, and her phone burnt out. So, also too, stories of a family literally going to a school car park with a child and the device to connect to the internet from the school, or going to the local Tim's, the coffee shops where you can get free access within there, but sitting out in the car park to access that. And that is the reality of our marginalized students. Another layer of frustration of, parents returning from home after a long day to support assignments and homework with subject areas that they have limited or no knowledge with. I remember years ago, when my daughter was in grade 10 and she needed some support around chemistry, just a portion of her chemistry work she wasn't quite understanding. And I had no clue. This is grade 10 chemistry. The last time I did chemistry was high school when I was preparing to go to nursing school. So, we have to look at those pieces that fail our children. So while school boards also are looking at anti-Black racism, especially with our amazing new director, Colleen Russell-Rawlins, anti-Black racism still impacts the education system, and boards are offering PD sessions, teaching and learning support, as well as revamping some policies. However, we've yet to see how that's really unfolding and trickling down within the systems around us. And parents are seeing that teachers are not addressing anti-Black racism as directed, especially online. And many parents are here, are wondering, and I wonder myself too, I'll be honest, that, are we using the pandemic as an excuse not to get the real job of anti-Black racism, anti-Indigenous racism, kicked out, so we can start having anti-racist practices within our school boards? And we also have to remember too, we have approximately 80% of Ontario teachers are white. My school board, approximately 79% of the staff is white. 83% are racialized. We have less than 10% Black teachers. Hence my t-shirt, Black Teachers Matter. And that's the logo on my Peel board mail. So, all of those things we have to take into consideration. And we know implicit bias continues in our classrooms each and every day, from teachers around us and to the leaders around us, very much so. What came to mind was Freakonomics, the book by Stephen Dubner, and chapter 6 is usually my go-to chapter, and that chapter basically highlights severe bias that we have around us, that takes place around us regarding non-Anglo-Saxon names, and the bias that takes place before even meeting potential employment candidates, looking at the names and discarding the applications. And this still plays out today in classrooms, with regards to racial bias in our classrooms and in the hiring practices, and based upon hiring practices and the lack of diverse hiring, to reflect the student body, we don't have enough Black and Indigenous teachers. We are always looked upon and pushed aside. We don't see enough, and we need to have children that see themselves in the classroom to help boost their self-esteem, to know that I can aspire to be a teacher, and that teacher can then aspire them to go on to greater things such as higher education. But when you have a teacher with bias, their mindset, and it's told to me, Cheryl, you're not going to amount to anything, don't bother go to university, so forth. And I'm like, you don't even know me. This was the first week I started in her class, and I'm like, I'm going to prove you wrong, lady. And I did. But not every child is going to turn that around, because it's the self-fulfilling prophecy that falls into place when they're seen and told that they're not reflected in the school environment. You're basically telling that child that they're not important. You're showing that child from your classroom and school environment that doesn't reflect them that they're not important. And even when I was a resource teacher going into schools before the education cuts, the first thing that I would do before going into the office, I'd deliberately go early, use the washroom, and then I would deliberately go and look at the staff photograph. And that would inform me of the building that I would be working with. And that would inform me of how I would navigate that building. You know, so back to the hiring practices, narcissy.com has an article, and the article is published titled "Canada Ranked as One of the Top Countries for Racial Discrimination in the Hiring Process." Canada, the land of opportunities and multiculturalism. That was the article that recently came out. You know, so that in itself informs why our school boards are the way they are and why other areas and sectors within this society are the way they are, because we are not valued. So, you know, for us to move forward, we need our co-conspirators. I don't like using the word allies, it's too soft. We need you to be a co-conspirator to work with us and to disrupt with us. If you have privilege, use it, don't abuse it. Use that privilege to help shift change, to change policies, and to really make sure that we can start dismantling anti-Black racism, because right now, excuse me, we're working in pockets because there are not enough of us. We need more to join and genuinely join, not just joining to fluff your portfolio, not just joining to add to your resume for promotion, because we generally see that happen. And then they move into positions, racialized people too, move into positions of leadership and do nothing. And that is very sad indeed. And I'll leave it there. So thank you.
Wow, Cheryl, lots and lots for us to take away from that. Amazing. Thank you. You've done a really amazing job of portraying the realities of what many of our students are living in, many of our educators are living in. And really, you know, as you're speaking, as both of you have been talking, I've really been thinking about the idea of when we talk about decolonizing, the Eurocentric idea that, you know, pathologizing and medicating and work individually, whereas many cultures seek solace from community and support in community. And, you know, my mom's friend and uncle, you know, I remember growing up, everyone's like, you have so many aunties. And I'm like, well, yeah, they're not really. I was kind of embarrassed. I'm like, they're not really my aunties. They're just like, I just call them my aunties. And everyone's like, what's wrong with you? Why would you call them your aunties if they're not your aunties? And I'm like, it's like a community thing. But I was actually embarrassed. Like I had internalized embarrassment about it. And it's only now that I have my own children that I'm like, hello, aunties, come and help out. You know, like it's like it shifts your lens. And many ethnic, you know, cultural groups, they have the sense of communities to support mental health and well-being. And I'm just thinking about the idea that many of our students now who would, when they are being pushed out and left out and erased in the curriculum in their classrooms, how they could turn to community to support their, you know, tethering mental health, and how that has also been taken away as a result of the pandemic.
Yes.
Like that's something that as you were speaking, I was thinking, oh my gosh, I never even thought about that, right? So we've got like this, we're taught to feel ashamed of our communities in many cases and ashamed of the way that our communities operate as wholes. That's detrimental to our mental health. So we don't feel like we can access it that way. But then of course, there's a very real pandemic that's taking place that's also blocking that ability for us to access when it comes to community. So lots of work for us to be doing in terms of that extra support that we should be doing, as opposed to pulling away from that additional support, as you've mentioned, is sometimes, you know, being used like it's a pandemic, we can't do this work. Like, of course you could do the work. You're the educator in the classroom. You're getting paid very good, healthy salaries in order for us to do this work. And it's a much more joyful work when we do it with our students and we build that community, that microcosm within our spaces, and really can respond, right? It brings the joy back to the work. I'm just wondering, so in terms of, I'm looking at our time, and I knew this would happen because of who's on this panel, but just working with Jennifer, what for our educators who are looking to support in schools, there are lots of programs and things that are out there. What have you seen that works within our schools to support mental health in a decolonized way?
Yeah. Well, I think that in a very specific decolonized way, that's taking some time, right? I haven't seen a lot of school systems currently that are, how should I say this? Not in the non-private sector really working it. But what I have been finding in my own research and speaking to colleagues trying to do this work in the education systems is really looking at a few factors. One of them for me is ACEs. I don't know if that's something, the ACEs score, looking at Dr. Nadine Burke Harris. She is the current Surgeon General of California, which is a really big deal. And in her work, working with youth in Bayview, Hunters Point in California, in a predominantly like Black and Latinx area, they've really started to look at how childhood trauma ends up increasing the risk for like leading causes of death for US. So it affects brain development, immune system, hormones, even the way that our DNA is transcribed and read. So we know that children who have high ACEs score, also which is known for adverse childhood experiences, end up having a shorter life expectancy and less all-around health. So right off the bat, part of what I'm helping some schools begin to do in New Jersey and New York City is to incorporate an ACEs sort of, not study, so to speak, but a qualitative study where we're not just doing numbers, but we're asking the community, what do you guys need? What would be helpful? Number one, childcare. We hear that more than ever, right? Even for families when it comes to school and checking homework. And as you were just saying, Cheryl, like all the reasons why family need more support. So I think that the ACEs is a nice place to start. But the next place I would say is asking students what they actually need, right? I find that universities, middle schools, elementary, they're bringing like $1 million consultants in, and some of that money could be utilized to actually support the community and the families that need it. Imagine that. No shade, but I mean, it's just like, I'm not going to even go off on a tangent on that, but I will say that the people know what they need. And that is another way, whether or not we're Black or brown administrators, you know, that is another way that we have internalized whiteness, right? That is another way that we have not lovingly decolonized some of our thoughts around who is an expert and who knows better. So instead of a needs assessment, right? Why don't we ask communities what they need, impacted communities? How are they suffering? What would you need? What kind of support do you need at home in working with your children and helping them do their schoolwork? And are you concerned about your children? Are you concerned to talk to them about suicidality or depression or anxiety? There are massive rates, right, of ED, like eating disorders, right, issues in school systems, all genders, right, and non-genders, we're seeing an increase and a rise. We're also seeing massive rates of depression and anxiety. And as you beautifully pointed out in the beginning, Cheryl, COVID is just another layer of trauma on top of already impacted communities, you know? So I think that it is also really crucial to talk to the communities, not at the communities, but talk to the communities. And when we talk about like really bringing education into the school systems, what I have found to be very helpful, once you get an understanding of what the students are seeing, and of course we have to ask questions like, you know, what is the number one concern from your friends? How would they identify this as a concern? You never say like, what is your concern? Because most adolescents are going to be like, oh no, I'm bored. I'm not talking to you about this. Adults, not all, but many. So I think it's really important to dig then into that place of, okay, this seems to be a concern according to these youth. They're saying that they want more information around depression, around anxiety, and that's what I see the most as well. And underneath all of that is trauma, right? So what I would say is everything needs to be trauma informed, including our teachers. Yeah, and teachers, I am not blaming you in any way, shape, or form. I'm going to hold the systems accountable that are not making the space, that are not providing the funding, that are not providing the time off for teachers, to deal with their own burnout, to deal with their own overwhelm, their own capitalism fatigue. I can't imagine, especially now during COVID, right? Attempting to teach. I mean, y'all are my heroes. Like attempting to teach youth that are home, that are trying to like nobody wants to focus again with the reparations, right? Like we need to call a moratorium on like work and labor and learning at this time. I mean, imagine, I know that I'm being a little bit whimsical here, but what would that look like in my fantasy world, to have had 6 months to a year where people like teachers have a time to separate, to pull back, to not do things the way that we have done them, which is every day from 8:30 or 9 o'clock till 4, this is what we're going to do. So I say this to say that our systems are not trauma informed, right? They think that a training or a workshop or paying half of whatever for a consultant to talk about trauma informed work and trauma informed teaching is enough. It's not. And with all due respect, I've also seen a great many teachers, needing a little bit more of the hands-on. So the training or the workshop may be one part of the umbrella, but the other part is, are they getting compensated and are they receiving consultation, right? I need to bring in case examples, right? I want to talk about little so-and-so, and I want to talk about how they come in and they're oppositional with me and it drives me nuts. But then what are better ways to deal with them? Because I know they're dealing with the death of their father or the incarceration of their uncle or the death of their older brother. Doesn't that make sense? So I really think that we also need to focus on treating our people better that are serving us, treating our teachers better, so that way that can also role model and trickle down into the youth that they are serving. And one of the last things I will say to this is that just talking about depression means nothing to some of our youth, right? Like, what are the symptoms? Like, what does that look like? Having trouble getting out of bed, wanting to do your chores, haha, or knowing that you have to do your chores, but having no energy to do it, or feeling irritable. I see this all the time in my teenagers. Their depression and their trauma really gets communicated and amplified with irritability and arguments sometimes, or shutting down completely. I'm good. Just leave me alone. Closing my door. Don't want to eat. I'm all right. So a lot of us don't know what's going on with our kids, So I think it is really, really crucial that we look at the ACEs, we look at trauma, we look how trauma has had a role, and we also incorporate trauma-informed principles. And then with that, take care of our teachers to make sure there is a sense of community consistently being facilitated among colleagues, among teachers, and providing formal opportunities and time for teachers to talk through and process difficult events, right? And these may include designated leaders or mentor teachers like Cheryl and others who can provide support for other classroom teachers. Yeah, I can keep going on about this. But lastly, I will say is, mindfulness and art pockets. Like, I don't know about y'all, but in the States, like they're taking away phys ed, they're taking away art classes. So I would highly recommend that we think about ways to continue to add drama therapy, art therapy. Hey, I do basketball therapy. Sometimes if I'm pulling a youth out, I'm like, oh, I got my ball with me. You want to play? And they're like, I knew you were tall, but I didn't know you played ball. And I'm like, well, I'm not good, but let's talk and play, right? Around the world, I get to ask a question, you make a shot. Like, I think we need to think outside of the box of what is therapeutic and what is healthy for our youth and our teachers.
I think Jennifer, you make really good points about the idea that trauma-informed practices. One of the number one things is the idea of relationships. And you speak to that beautifully, the idea that we need to build those relationships with our students, ask them, what do they need? We need to build those relationships with the community to say, how can we work together in conjunction? How can I best, represent and bring community into my classroom in a way that is meaningful to your child and to our child collectively that we are helping to nurture and grow and take care of? and Dr. Kristen McLeod, I remember she put together like this little pyramid in this workshop that I went to, where she talked about trauma-informed practices, and social emotional well-being was like one of the highest levels of cognitive regulation, self-regulation, like above, academic regulation in terms of the mental capacity that it takes. And of course, underlying all that was relationships. If you don't have the relationships, the learning doesn't happen, the self-regulation doesn't happen, the self of identity doesn't happen. And so, all these things are missed when we don't build those relationships and start with centering our students and their identities, right? Also, Dr. Janine Jones, she talked about the idea that many of us miss cues when it comes to Black children, when it comes to Indigenous children, when it comes to Asian children, because many of the, I guess, classical manifestations that we look for as, somebody who's experiencing depression, somebody who's experiencing trauma, we take it again from a colonial lens. So many of these things that we've been historically looking for are for a white child. They are not for many of the children that are in front of us, and we're missing this. And so, where is the time that we take to educate ourselves? So I have that piece of knowledge now. Good for you, Sayema. What are you going to do with that? Because now I got to go teach my chemistry, my biology, my, this committee, that committee, this community organization. Where's the time for that, to decompress that, to process it, and to work as a community of educators and healthcare providers to really think about, so what does this mean for our practice within the classroom?
Yeah.
So where is all that, right?
Right.
I'm looking at the time, it's 8:31. Okay. All right. Okay. We're gonna draw to a very quick close. Just two quick things. This is not so quick, but it can be quick. So talking about trauma-informed practices and social emotional regulation, our government has recently proposed a new curriculum for mathematics, where we are linking social emotional learning formally within the curriculum of mathematics. So it's something that we can now evaluate in the context of math. Some people are loving it because there's formal recognition that social emotional learning is something that's so critical and important to the well-being of the whole child. And there are some that are kind of like, hold on a second, have we really thought through this in a proper way? Why don't we start with you, Cheryl? What are your thoughts on that?
Oh, wow. Oh, where shall I start? Yeah, while social emotional and math looks great on paper, one has to ask themselves, who was at the table and on the menu when they revised that new math curriculum? Because obviously I do not believe it was delivered from a race equity lens and a standpoint. Because we know 80% of the province teachers are white. We know that's basically the makeup of school boards. So we know those are the teachers delivering the bulk of that social emotional piece. And we know that those are the teachers. We also have anti-Black racism within other racialized communities too. You have to remember that as well, very much so. And, the delivery concerns me because it will be through their lens, which is not trauma informed, their lens, not culturally responsive, and their lens with bias. So they will be assessing and monitoring our students, and that deeply concerns me with regards to how they assess what they assume social emotional learning should look like, when they have no understanding that within across the cultures, students react to trauma differently in different ways. And their emotions are either bottled up because we are taught when we go to school, don't tell the teacher your business, because they're worried that CAS may turn up on their desktop for the slightest of things. Because we know that CAS has a habit of taking our Black and Indigenous children, and which is like taking our enslaved African ancestors' children away, and the same as placing our Indigenous children in residential schools. So they've just reformed that into CAS. So, we have to really look at that standpoint, and it concerns me. The whole mindfulness and the zones of regulation has always been a big problem for me, because, who is it really for? The teacher or the students? Because you see all these things that they're doing, mindfulness and deep breathing, and they'll post it on social media. And when you analyze and look at the teacher, more times than not, the teacher doesn't reflect the student body. And it's their lens that they are teaching it from. And it's their lens that they're assessing it from. So it deeply concerns me how the new curriculum is really going to fully unfold without, it's just another layer of racism that we have to navigate, basically, because now we're going to be assessed on how we feel and how we react and how we should feel and how we should react. So I have deep concerns around that. And I'll basically leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Mullan, any opinions?
I think Cheryl nailed it. I just want to add, as a way to uplift what has already been said, that I think that there's a lot of structural advantage. Yeah, there's a lot of structural advantage for the very large percentage of white teachers and this white frame to continue to apply unconscious or consciously, right, microaggression or microassault or macro ones onto students, and I dare say even other colleagues, right? How often, I would imagine you're always, I mean, I experience it myself through colleagues, you know, being on elevators and a colleague saying, oh, is it your first day of class? And I'm like, yep, it is. And they're like, oh, when are you going to graduate? And I'm like, oh, I'm teaching this class. Like what? like I'm sorry, no, I'm teaching multicultural 605 for counselors, right? But you know, just the level of degradation and overwhelm that plays out. And as I was looking at some of the modules, all I kept thinking to myself is, who are holding the teachers accountable for some of this? Like, who are holding them accountable? What is that structure and the criteria for that? And here, this is just another way that we're going to overdiagnose and pathologize very healthy, understandable reactions to this world feeling out of control, particularly, right, for marginalized people. So if there's already all this anti-Blackness, what's going to happen when a young Black person, you know, gets pissed and just kicks a garbage can? You know, I'm not saying that they get to like harm someone else, but the rage is expended as just like, oh, F this, I'm done, I don't want to do this. And then that gets pathologized. So to me, in my mind, as a psychologist and someone who worked and trained, as we all do, in poor communities and poor Black communities, what I would say is the school system often becomes the beginning pipeline, as we know, into the criminal justice system, right? So a lot of the kids that I've seen then when I've worked in juveniles and upstate, as we call it, often what I see is that they have oppositional defiant diagnosis, right? Or they're having some sort of behavioral diagnosis. But what is the root of the behavior? It only seems that we engender that empathy when we're talking about lighter skinned or white children, right? And I would like a lot more of that empathy and that understanding and that curiosity also engendered to our darker bodied children. So yeah, I think it's dangerous. I would agree with Cheryl, like who was in the room and who was at the table and who wasn't at the table. Right? I would bet a lot of parents were not at that table and a lot of parents that were Black and Indigenous ancestry. So it concerns me. That's what I would say. Big concerning. And it doesn't feel trauma informed from my angle and my lens.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, also like, you know, it's kind of rolled out and just going back to, you know, training and frameworks. I don't know that there were some fulsome conversations around that. I think that for me, I was very torn, and part of me, one of my thoughts were, so now we have, we know that bias already plays into the way that we evaluate our students, and now we're doing it. It's like another double layer of now here's another way that we can allow bias to impact our students. And this time it's going to be on record in terms of a numerical assessment or an alphabetical assessment on the capacity of this child. So maybe they're math whizzes, but maybe the way that they're expressing frustration having to do with math, or maybe having to do with life, or maybe having to do with racial trauma, because that is a very real sense of trauma, which we're surrounded with, you know, all the time. There is no escape. And now, as a result, they're not going to be valued for their mathematical thinking and contribution. Now it's going to be, you know, it's okay, all right. I just thought, you know, as the experts, I would just throw it out there and see what you have to say. Cheryl, did you want to add anything to this?
Briefly, because I know we're heading towards the end. Jennifer mentioned the school to prison pipeline with regards to the police within schools. And I just want to give a shout out to Advocacy Peel, an amazing group who are activists, ground roots, who actually helped channel and help to support the removal of the SRO officers, the police officers, from our school board, and also to the Dufferin Peel School Board, and they'll be looking at expanding around the GTA. So they've done huge work, unpaid labor, several hours of committed work to make sure that we boot out the police from our schools, because there's no need to have them there. So yeah, that was my piece. Thank you.
Awesome. Well, thank you. Oh, I see Sultan.
Yes, I feel like a helicopter reporter that just comes in and be like, "All right, from the view here, everybody." I just wanted to say, a message was put out to the chat box, letting everyone know that, to not work in the colonized structure of time and pushing us for time, working within fixed periods of time. We'll just wait for a natural end to this conversation. So all of those who are here, all 255 people who are still here, I think agree with that notion. So I wanted to say that, we had some great activity in the chat box, a lot of questions, nothing but affirmations, agreements, provoking questions, unlearning. It was spectacular. The question I would like to put forward from the chat box, and there was quite a few, and I appreciate everyone who put something forward. I think there's a lot in listening to our panelists. I think there's a lot we're going to unpackage, and a lot of learning and action that we ourselves are going to own, and we're going to move forward in our way, in our context, with our realizations from this talk. So that has informed some of the questions I have to unfortunately not ask. But the one question I do feel, this seems very actionable and might even present itself tomorrow with some of our attendees. And this question comes from AE. And it is, how might we respectfully challenge counseling psychology professors who blindly and decisively perpetuate white pedagogies or theories or frameworks and overlook the perspectives and experiences of students who are Black, Indigenous, and those who are people of color? And I'd like to put an editorial in here. Feel free to omit respectfully.
I would say try and seek out a practitioner that's culturally responsive. I have issues currently, I'm just going to say it. My board, the majority, and with several other boards, the majority of the PSSP staff, which is psychology, social work, and speech and language pathology, are white. And again, they come without, most times than not, the majority without a race equity lens, trauma-informed lens, and they come with their own white gaze and white privilege alongside. And I remember in a few case conferences in my old role where, Black parents were just happy to see me at the table, because you come into this meeting about your child that is deemed bad, and now you're surrounded and intimidated by a sea of white faces, and they'll see I always, I can just see the check and they're like, oh my gosh, there's someone that looks like me, and then working and connecting with them. And, they asking, do you not have Black psychologists or social workers in the board? And, and then I would help to advocate. And then the white psychologists and the white social workers would get their backs up and offended, centering themselves and their whiteness around, why is it that they need? Why do we have to go and ask X, Y, and Z? Why can't I? Well, you're not, all respectfully, you have the qualifications and training, but that's in the field within whiteness. So, with that part, we have to be very careful, and a lot of, I'm sure there are some listening online where it's very important that they respect that request from the Black, African and Caribbean and Indigenous, parent that is advocating for their child, and they know what's best for their child, and you're not always best for that child. So it's a matter of, let's seek out someone that will best serve, because at the end of the day, it's the child that we need to center, not you. And I'll leave it there.
Yes. I would also say, because and maybe I misheard wrong, but I also heard this piece there around like a professor, right? And like not including something, but I could got it wrong. But what I keep thinking to myself is, I understand this. I have gone through it, much like Cheryl, like I can feel that activation in my body because majority of my education was that way. Yeah, and I was not given, great things to read that were inclusive of any of our people. So what I would say is ask for what you need, caveat, not alone. I would not do it by yourself because we know that there's a power differential, there's a hierarchy there, and it just may make you feel unsafe. So I would say, is there another student? Is there another colleague? Is there someone else there in the classroom? And a number of you, not two, a few of you, do you even have some white co-conspirators and accomplices that can be the mouthpiece to say, hey, and I know I made an assumption that that person was not white, but they might have been, they can say, hey, we need to hear a little bit more of this as well because of all of these reasons, because we're dying, because we are looking at coloniality and we're in a post-colonial society, but what does that mean and what does that look like? I've had students not just bring up my work, but other work from people across media and say, hey, look at this article, look at that. Can we talk more about this? Can we talk more about Ken Hardy's work in counseling? Can we talk more about Dr. Joy DeGruy-Leary's work? Like Nancy Boyd Franklin, can we start bringing in some of these Black and South Asian educators that will continue to expand our breadth of knowledge, right? Like whiteness does not get to claim our education. We also need to decolonize the F out of white pedagogy because it is harmful and violent.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. Yes. Thank you. All that. So I have more questions, but I know I'm going to be respectful of the timelines over here of our panelists as well as our audience. We know that Sultan and I and the planning committee, when we were initially, thinking about this topic, we knew that this would just be a conversation opener. We knew that many of us would be left with a lot more wonderings and questions and areas to explore and continue to learn and, think about what do we do with this? What do we do with this gift of knowledge, the privilege of this knowledge? How do we take this and mobilize it into action? So as we close, if we could just take some extra time, for our panelists to just share with us, where do we go from here? How do we continue our learning? Because we know that this is just an opener for us. And whoever would like to start.
Okay. Oh, right. What a great closer. Well, number one, I would say is to find ways to internally decolonize and have compassion for oneself in the ways, particularly, Black, Indigenous, Caribbean identified people, like have some compassion with the ways that we have been collectively socialized to internalize whiteness, right? Down to colorism, right? Who is smart, who gets to take up space, down to looking at, the ways that we view each other and the ways that anti-Blackness continues to be perpetuated even within the Black and Brown communities. So one of the first things I would say is start taking a look inside before we start putting our lens externally. Start to learn and understand that, as Nipsey Hussle said, this is a marathon, right? This isn't a one-stop shop. There ain't no workshop that is going to get you decolonized, honey. It don't work like that. Like this is a process, right? This is a process. And I know that I'm still in this process. And I feel like I've been doing this work for about 15 years, not naming it this, but undoing, like, and it's another door and another box and another box and another box, and allow yourself to get called in. I feel like we change most when we're uncomfortable, right? Not unsafe, but uncomfortable. So go to your growing edge and be willing to not know. Particularly those of us with more advanced degrees, be willing to be the newbie, be willing to go to community organizations and activists and take workshops and give your money. Learn from the grassroots people doing this work, sleeping on floors, supporting each other. That's mutual aid. That's support. You know, so I would say be kind, be compassionate, hold yourself accountable, let people call you in, and sometimes we may need to be called out. Sometimes if we're doing harm, we may need to be called out. And before you get defensive and shut down, look at who is being impacted by your actions, and really take a long, hard look at yourself. And yeah, be accountable. Hold yourself accountable.
Mhm.
Loved
you.
all of that. It's true. We've got to look at ourselves first before we can even attempt to go outside, because many of us hold bias. Many of us are still conflicted. Many of us still have trauma. Many of us have, internalized colonialism, impacted within us. I'd also say, go to onabse.org, ONABSE, sorry, .org, onabse.org. Also look at the Black Health Alliance, there. Also go to Advocacy Peel on Facebook, because there are some trauma-informed people there behind the scenes to support you. But also, I'd say, encourage you to spoon feed yourselves knowledge and information. Don't let others spoon feed you, because I keep seeing people going around gathering others' information and taking from the work from others, the heavy labor from others, and not crediting, but yet using it for their own personal agenda. If you're genuinely interested in decolonizing mental health and education, you really do the work. You really just, pull your sleeves up, get on with the work, do a lot reading, connect with people around you, people that don't look like you, to help support your journey, people, that will support your learning and journey towards decolonization. If you're truly interested, you'll do the work. If not, it's the usual superficial, let me just add this to my resume and my portfolio, and that will help my promotion, and then that's it. So, that's what I'll say from there. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Mullan at Decolonizing Therapy. You have a beautiful website, right? It's Decolonizing Therapy. And I've been fangirling you from afar, truth be told, because I've been watching your webinars and following your articles. And so this is such a privilege and honor to have you here. And Cheryl, I mean, you walk the walk, and it's an inspiration to see how you enact the decolonization process in your classrooms and working with students, and you inspire on a daily at all different levels. So thank you so much for the two of you. Thank you so much to our audience. Thank you so much to Sultan for ensuring that we are going through smoothly on the internet. And over to you, Sultan, any closing remarks?
Yeah, I just want to thank, at the highest point, we had 360 live streamers, but at the current moment, we have 151. Thank you so much for hanging in with us. But the interesting thing is we've already had 730 replays back. So people are chiming in even after the live stream has commenced, and either catching up or starting on or passing as someone, and someone's watched a little bit and it will return back to it. So it'll be really interesting to see how many viewers we have in even a couple of days. I wanted to let all of those who registered and came through, thank you so much for coming, and know that we will be sending a copy of this recording to you hopefully in about a week, but then it will also be posted up on our site. I would like to give a special big up and respect to Farah Rahmatullah, who is the colleague of Sayema and I, who is live tweeting right now on the FESI Twitter account. So much respect to the live tweeting. That is a job on its own. So thank you, Farah. I'd like to myself as well thank our panelists. I'm just elated to be in the same digital room as you. If for whatever COVID has brought to us, I am a better person for having be in digital rooms and have digital opportunities like this to be in your presence and learn from you. So on behalf of Sayema and I, thank you. On behalf of the whole chat box and the YouTube world, thank you so much. And everyone, thank you so much for chiming in to FESI, the third webinar in our series. Have a great night, be well, and see you at the next session.